Well, thank you very much, Chair, for the introduction. And now I've been here about 20 minutes, I now realise I've been absolutely useless as any kind of police witness. Isn't it funny how when you come to a place which has got a different context, you bump into people that you have seen in a different context somewhere else, you don't necessarily straight away recognise them. It's happened to me 3 times today where I've bumped into people who I've seen before, I've met before, but put them into a different context and I completely recognise them. But I probably now have an insight as to what happens to police witnesses who ask to see, did you recognise that person? Because they haven't been seen, they don't. Thank you very much for the invitation today. What I intend to do is just offer some comment and analysis, not got any major big reform ideas or anything like that, nothing groundbreaking, but more around trying to analyse the police service at the moment, where it may be going in the future, and just offering some sort of comment and analysis. If you're in the police service at the moment, I think it's a really strange environment, really. Certainly in my recollection and in my service, I can't remember, certainly at the senior level, working with an administration which is a coalition. And I think not just for policing, I think right across the whole public service, that's quite difficult and challenging to understand quite who and where you dance to. You've got a situation really where I think police officers feel a little bit uncertain, feel a bit beleaguered. Some of that may be justified, some of it may not. I'm not necessarily saying this is a bad thing, it's understandable, but it's quite notable for the first time in my memory that we've got chief constable vacancies now in the sort of mid-20s, getting up to 30, the sitting tenants who are there temporarily because it was the wait till the new crime commissioners came along. But in terms of leadership, that's sort of quite strange. And then we've got other incidents that have happened, the Mitchell Gate incident and other things that all got put into the mix. I think from the policing perspective, and certainly the people I speak to, it's a really uncertain time. And it's not a very, in some places, a happy ship, it has to be said. So let's have a look at that. Let's see whether or not that feeling of being rejected, a little bit downhearted, is justified or it's just part of cop culture who are trying to resist what is seen as a reform programme. The title, you're very right to pick up on that. And take away the first word, I've added that. Force the only way to change the police actually was a headline in one of the broadsheets about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Probably done more for effect than anything else. But actually, when you looked at the article underneath it, the commentator was framing arguments to support that contention. So I think let's start to test that. Is force the only way to change the police, rather than what was asserted by the commentator, that force is the only way to change the police? So what are the critics of the police actually saying? And I've been interested, you can play a little game with yourself if you want. Where do these quotes come from? I mean, they're pretty damning, really. If you're in the face of hearing this being said, whether you think it's justified or not, being described in this way, I reckon it's pretty tough. The last great unreformed public service must be open to outside pressure. Implication there is that they're not, research said. A force that does not improve should face a management takeover. Well, that'd be interesting. There's a sort of an analysis being a link there being put with the commercial world where you could see that as probably feasible. I'm not so sure what a management takeover would look like in a public service that's looking after public safety, law enforcement, etc. The force today would still be recognisable to someone who joined up to half a century ago. Well, I've left 5 years coming up this 2 weeks or so. And actually, in those 5 years, it's completely unrecognisable in some quarters to me. So I'd like to test that, maybe. This is probably the one that's really sort of difficult to take on the chin if you're a serving cop. Saying there that it still operates a shop steward model that holds off all offers of outside help. It's a bit similar to the one at the top there, where it's sort of very much bunker mentality, head down, and hopefully all this will go away and we can get on with policing as we know it. Yet, as I say, politicians, media, mandarins, commentators, that's where those quotes are attributable to. So I thought to myself, well, what's feeding these views then? You don't surely just pluck them out of the air just to be antagonistic. They're obviously rooted in a perception or opinion. I'd like to understand where that's come from. What is it about? And again, it's not the full answer, I'm sure, to the exam question, but I've come up with 4 points which I think are some of the things that are feeding those views. Apparent failings. I'll explore these bullet points in more detail in the next couple of slides. A perception of falling standards. There's political objectives. Nothing new there, I guess. And a perception that policing resists change. Well, some of the contemporary cases, issues that really are probably feeding this are seen there. I mean, I just sort of random really, I went online and just plucked out some of the newspaper reports of the time against all these. And the first one, the Rotherham sex abuse case. Now, I'm not familiar, other than phone hacking for obvious reasons, I'm not familiar with the other ones, the details of it, and I'm sure there's explanations to it. But nevertheless, the way it's reported is really difficult and really awkward. The Rotherham case, if you remember, it was the newspapers actually who have unravelled that there's these unreported crimes, alleged crimes, that have been going on over many years that show that despite lots of warnings, which included to the police and the probation service, going back as far as the year 2000, were ignored, or they were treated with a very sort of laissez-faire attitude. I don't know whether that's right or not, but that's the conclusion as a lot of people have said, and that's what's put out there in the public domain. In phone hacking, the irony of me standing here speaking, someone else is speaking about phone hacking, and I think that whether you can make a defence about what the police did, what politicians have done, other people have done, it doesn't take away from the fact that there's criminality alleged, which needs to be tested in the court and assessed in the court. And if you look at the police side, whilst I'm sure there's explanations, of which I've offered my own, you can't get away from the perceptions being left as a result of that, which is really difficult for the police to try and, I think, refute. Fiona Pilkington. And again, I'm sure there's lots of explanations as to why this didn't get picked up, but got a tragic outcome where not only was her daughter lost her life, but also herself over a suicide. So life had got so tough in the housing estate in Leicestershire that they were at their wits' end, it's reported, to the point where they just didn't know where to turn. And one of the agencies which, sadly, the jury found was wanting was the police, and to the councils, but nevertheless we're looking at the perception of the police. And it was seen here as just laissez-faire response. I think I can probably understand in some ways why that may have been. It's the left hand not talking to the right, and it may well be that information and intelligence coming in hadn't been joined up. Well, that's fine, but you've got to get that sorted, because the perception is there was a failure. More recently, going back some years, but we've got a panel now that has come out and concluded from analysis of the evidence, and one has to say that it appears to be a well-represented panel, it appears to be balanced, and they're asking questions that need to be tested. And the IPCC, and I see that Deborah is talking a little bit later, have really got their work cut out there to get to the bottom of that. But nevertheless, there's a responsibility and allegations being made against the police that are leaving an awkward feel. And again, Jimmy Savile, who knows how that's going to conclude, that along with more recently allegations against Cyril Smith gave us a sort of horrible feel that the police may or may not have done things differently. I mean, the perception of falling standards, again, Deborah may touch on this. Some of them are still alive, so it'd be wrong to stand here in any kind of judgment. But what we do know, there have been some findings of guilt recently, and at both senior and middle management level, which has resulted in some people being dismissed, pending appeals, of course, but some of them have gone through that, and those convictions stand. And there are many high-profile IPCC investigations still alive, and I guess we'll see whether they lead to discipline sanctions, but some of them have. There's allegations at the moment in one county force around crime stats and the reporting of crime. Unresolved, but they still hang around there, and they are actually probably leading to the perception of falling standards. And there are many examples where critics will say that really the way in which you're providing the service is completely been eroded. Again, I looked at the way in which we were being judged, the police service that is, around service provision. And if you look at the number of complaints coming in against the police, over half of them, albeit the number of complaints has reduced by 9% over the last year, but those who have been recorded are all around incivility, rudeness and lateness around how you respond to the report of crime. The political objectives, they're feeding this perception of those critical comments. I have to say I've got real problems around whether or not the police and crime commissioners are the panacea. No system is absolutely brilliant, I know that. If you were talking to police authorities, and I went to a recent meeting with one that was obviously being dissolved, and it was invited the previous chief constables to come along to this sort of event to mark its falling away, they would argue that the invisibility of the police authority actually was a strength of being a critical friend. I've worked with a police authority as a chief constable. I would never say for 1 minute that was a walk in the park. And yes, they did try and put an arm out to the public to consult. And having sat in public meetings myself with police authority chairs and police authority members, it's really tough to get to the real issues that are going to influence the way in which you police. And there is a danger that we have raised expectations to such a level that the public will have a say, but actually I find that it's not as if this hasn't already been a route that's been charted before. And I think we should listen to the experience of others who've tried this, and it's just been really difficult and a failure. And I'm not sure that going to the electorate with such a low turnout, albeit I guess it's going to be bumpy for the first 2 or 3 elections, and maybe in 10, 15 years' time we'll see the real fruit of our labours. But nevertheless, I'm not sure that's going to suddenly overnight change things. We have now the first non-cop Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary. That's ruffled a few feathers in that the argument goes, well, how can someone who's never been a Chief Constable be someone who's going to stand in judgment and make recommendations about the way in which policing operates? As you'll see here later, I actually think it's a strength, and I'm not objecting to that at all. Nevertheless, that starts to feed this perception I've laid out in an earlier slide. It is tough around policing and the budget, as it is with lots of public service. I don't know whether you realise that by 2015, the police funding will be 1.36 billion less than it was in the years 2011. So that's a reduction of 2 billion, which represents 20%. And that is really difficult. Having managed the budget both in Norfolk and in the Met, to shave 20% off the budget, which represents 80% of which represents your head count, there are many places you can go. And I know from talking to my colleagues, it's not as if people have sat on their hands for the last 5 or 6 years, they've already been shaving off. So I think that 20% is tough around austerity, and especially as the previous Chief Inspector of Constabulary argued that 12% is doable, but you go beyond that, you start losing cop numbers. What about this allegation, charge, Your Honour, the perception that policing resists change, right? These are really difficult to walk away from. The Winter Report says the perception among some of the public was that policing was largely an intellectually undemanding occupation. It had more in common with blue-collar factory workers with a clock-in, clock-out mentality. Well, that goes, crikey, the perception I've got is just, I forget that it was Peter Sellers in the 1960s on film, where he was working in a factory and it was all out brothers and very sort of shop studio. That's not the police service that I recognise. And I find it a little bit awkward to accept the sort of thick cop label that some are very quick to lay out. And that's not implied, it's explicit in that quote. And I think if you went in and sat on the side of the shoulders of a lot of cops at both junior level and the senior level, I don't think they're devoid of intellect, especially some of the things they have to try and grapple with. But when you then see the Federation who can't strike, then all joining together for the second time in about 15 years and marching onto Westminster, well, you're providing the material to support the first bullet point, and therefore it's very difficult to square that circle, I think. And when the Home Secretary, whatever you think of him or her, is addressing the Federation, decorum then fades away and frustration starts to come through with a lot of heckling and a lot of insult, and this is only going to go one way, spiralling downhill. And when push comes to shove, the Home Secretary is forced into saying that the things that she does about reform, and then the Federation rebut that by saying we're on the precipice of destroying what the Home Secretary is, a police service that is admired throughout the world. And some would say that's a very emotional statement, and there's playing on the emotion as opposed to the factual analysis. So, you know, I asked the question, is this a fair assessment? Well, actually, some could say it's harsh, because what they would argue is that well, over the last 5 or 10 years or so, costs have been voluntarily driven down. It's not as if, as I said earlier, the police service has sat on its hands. And without boring you around that detail, from my own personal experience, I can remember going away in a darkened room with a wet towel on your head, trying to find savings without losing cop numbers. I know there's been some notable operational failures, but if you're in the camp of saying it's a harsh criticism, you would obviously bring out things like the Olympics as being the jewel in the crown as to what British policing, working with other agencies and volunteers, can really produce on a world stage. No pressure there, but they raised to the challenge. And although, you know, when I was writing for the Times, which seemed like a good idea at the time, I did say there that, but probably critically, the way in which the protests were being policed on the student march and elsewhere just maybe lost public support. But I think the police service showed that it can come through that, and it actually did a good job in more recent times. I've been an advocate of reducing the number of police forces across the country. I tried really hard to do that in East Anglia and failed miserably. I don't think the timing was particularly right, and there was certainly no appetite to do that. So the sort of next stop will be collaboration and business alliances, trying to, in a way, give you better buying power when you're procuring for services, and also joining up when you look to operational delivery. Where I live in Essex, we join up with Kent, and we've had joint investigations of the murders in Harlow. It's been now labelled a murder, where that dreadful case of the doctor who's lost his wife and children. And there was another terrible case in the north of Essex, where an off-duty police officer was murdered, off-duty trying to save someone's life. That was dealt with by Kent and Essex Police. It's a terrible journey to get across that bridge, but actually the prize operation is really worth it. And, you know, I've looked at the what success would look like in the Home Secretary's eyes, in her reported speeches, and in her eyes, and that of ministers, is that if you reduce reported crime, and we know that's got all the different sort of factors that can affect it, then you're doing okay. So if you're a cop, you'd be saying, well, we reduced it 27% lower than 2002. But to be balanced, let's look at the other side of the coin. Is it a fair assessment? Well, I think there's some very, very compelling arguments here. I've got a real problem trying to understand the Federation's perspective around resisting some of the recommendations of Windsor. You know, when you rub shoulders with, you know, friends in the pub who thought they were going to retire at a certain age on a certain package, and suddenly, because of all the things that have gone on, they can't. Or if they do retire, it's not going to be index linked, and you're going to be nearly over 60. You know, you're not 48 and a half on an index linked pension. And also, it's not about how long you work, it's what you're doing at work and whether you're fit for work. And sometimes when you look at cops who are supposed to be in a fit type job, you can't help but think how the hell they're going to chase after a criminal. So I believe there's no sympathy out there with the public around the objections to Windsor, and I buy into that. And when you think that the public's consent is needed to police, that's a difficult place to be in, I think. And is that the battle you want to fight when you're looking to get better reform, better advancement as a police service? Probably not, because actually that guy in the pub I have a drink with every Friday night will say, just looking after your own. You're gilding your own purse. And it's also probably a fair assessment when you look at the way in which the police service has been slow to react to social media. They've been outwitted. When Prince Charles and Camilla were attacked in the rolls coming down by central London, it was because the cops were just not able to, not being overly critical now, be in the same boat if I was still serving, understand what social media is about and how to actually interject with it. And I don't think the facing change of crime has been absorbed. We still haggle about, we've reduced burglary, we've reduced theft, or whatever else it might be, or violence. Yeah, they're important things, but they're not the crimes that are being committed. You know, what about the financial world? What about eco-crime? What about the people who are now able to hack into big institutions? Are the cops fit for purpose on that? Horrible term, but actually describes what probably people are thinking. So I think the cops tend to hang on to the things they already know rather than looking ahead and getting people into help. Point I'll come back to a little bit later.
I'm not sure that a little bit later is going to be available.
Oh, we can.
I wonder whether you can.
We've got 3 slides.
Okay.
Yeah. Are the coalition reforms hitting the spot? There, on the left-hand side, is the headings of which the Home Office publish their reform programme, and they're the things that they're going to do. The one thing that in their blurb that they provide is that the programme of reform will be coherent and comprehensive. It's certainly comprehensive, I'm not sure it's coherent. So building for the future, what are my top 4? This is probably good for questions if we've got time. I think it's a Windsor plus. You've already seen, I've shown my hand, I think Windsor is, you can't deny it. But actually I think we should go one step further. We've made a civilian appointment of Chief Inspector of Constabulary. I think there's a case to say Chief Constable doesn't have to be a cop. It's gone through all the ranks. If I look at the things I used to do as a Chief Constable, policing was like 0.5%. Other people did the operational things, I had to run the business. Jackie Smith, when she came out Home Secretary, she went on record as saying, 1 minute I'm the Minister, the next minute I'm the Chief Executive of a massive multi-million-pound business, and I haven't really got a clue about how you do that. Time to focus on the police role. If you don't need a warrant card to do it, why are you doing it? And I think when you've got cop numbers reducing, there's a real strong compelling case for that. I saw some cops the other day standing in a building, a housing estate, where there was some offenders doing community work. And the community work was their punishment. We had social workers, probation there, and we had cops just supervising and clearing up rubbish. You don't need a warrant card to do that. You don't need to be a cop to do it. Realign the national agencies. You've heard from Trevor. I won't go into that. I think there's some incompatible bed partners in that structure, not least of which protection of children. They will be the poor relation in a bigger pot of fighting serious crime. And the greater use of technology, IBM, obviously giving you a bit of a gig on that. And I think when I had police officers sitting in front of CCTV screens trying to identify the bombers at 7/7 by their behaviour and what they were doing, if only we'd had that before they did the bomb, and we had technology that was identifying strange behaviour of people walking on the underground. We don't want to do it after the event. We're looking for the same characteristics after the event that we should be doing before the event. So let's use technology. Finally, Chairman, you'll be pleased to see this is my last slide. Is force the only way to change the police? No. Provided you keep the politics out of the policing reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to abuse my position as chair to defend a bit of politics to answer something that you just said, which was that children would be the poor relation of the NCA. You may have seen the outline of the framework document which is to govern the NCA, something that we politicians have been calling for, and noting notably, the only bit of it really which is fleshed out is the principles to govern seal. And that, I think, has come because there has been so much call, not just by politicians, obviously, where we voice what is being said elsewhere, sometimes effectively, sometimes not. But it is clear that there's a real concern to support seal. So I hope on that you're right.
We're singing off the same song sheet, Chair. I'm one concerned about how seal will fight its factors within that structure to get the funding and get a piece of the action. What you've just described is exactly what we want politicians to do, which is to hear what everyone's saying and represent the view. What I'm saying is sometimes people ignore that, and the political imperative of whatever that party is the driver, and it's not based on any kind of evidence.
Well, I shouldn't have done that, but there we are. Questions for Andy Hayman. Given them quite a lot to think about, so it's probably still being absorbed, is it?
See better.
Right. Well, shall we move on then to probation?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.